Hello and welcome to this little tutorial on how to make a little sound effects manager. So the point of this script is basically every now and again in a game you're going to need to play sounds that don't necessarily need to be attached to an object. So obviously when you play a sound you need to have an audio source. So I'll just quickly create a... Oh, by the way, I've created this little scene here because basically what we're doing today is going to be almost entirely in code, and if we didn't have anything to look at it might be a bit dry. So I've created some pretty lights to distract you from the fact that it's a pretty boring tutorial. So if we just created an empty object, you would need an audio source, and in that audio source you could just drag a sound clip into here and you could play that, and then you could write a script attached to this object to tell the audio source to play the sound clip, and that would be fine. But it's a bit unnecessary to have. If you imagine, well, Minecraft for example, I know most of the people who subscribe to my channel are aware of that game because that's why you're here, for the Minecraft tutorials. If you imagine Minecraft, every time a sheep bars or every time an arrow hits something, a sound has to be played, but it's not necessarily the most efficient use of resources to have a sound component attached to every arrow and every sheep and every other object that's going to make a one-off sound every now and again. So what this tutorial is going to do is going to help us play random sounds on the fly without having to have a sound component attached. So we will get straight into it. So we're going to, if you just ignore the scripts that are already in here, these are all to do with this weird little lighting setup, and we'll create a new script. We're just going to call it Sound FX Handler. And we'll go straight into it. We don't need that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a few public variables. We need an int called, we're going to call it max sources. We will set it as a default 5. So all this is going to be is our sound effects handler is going to create audio sources as it needs them. If it doesn't need them, it's going to use existing audio sources, but if we try to play a sound and we don't have any available audio sources, it will create more up to this limit. So if you set this to 5 and there are currently 5 sounds playing, it won't play another sound. It'll just throw up a warning message and say, sorry, we've got no more audio sources. 5 is obviously a ridiculously low number. If you're having a quite large game, you'd set more than 5 audio sources, but this is just to show you how it works. And before we can do the rest, well, we're going to have a list of audio sources as well. And it wants to be a list so that we can dynamically alter it quite easily. So add and remove, well, not remove, but add audio sources to it as we go. And before we can go any further, we're going to need to create a custom class. Well, we don't need to create a custom class, but we're going to create a custom class because why the hell not? So we want this custom class to be outside of our main class, obviously. It wants to be serializable so that we can edit it in the inspector. And we're just going to call it sound effects. And in here is where all of our sound details are going to be stored. So we'll start off, we'll give it a name. And this will be important. This isn't just for ease of use when you're working with the sounds in the inspector. This will actually come into play in the code. And we'll give everything a default value. We will need an actual clip, an audio clip. This will be the sound that is played. And then a few values, and these values are like, so I'm only going to give it 2 values, sorry, to illustrate what we're doing here. You can feel free to give it as many values as you like. I'll just quickly show you what these values apply to. So if we go back to our empty object that I've deleted, we add our audio source again. These values correspond to all these settings here. So I'm only going to give it 2 values. I'm going to give it a volume value and a loop bool. You can give it as many values as you want. It doesn't matter. You can just change the volume. You can leave all the settings completely default, or you can change every setting in here. It's entirely up to you. I don't need to change every setting to show you how it works. So those values are public bool loop and public float volume. We'll leave, obviously, that's default as false, and this will default as 1, which is maximum because volume is normalized. Now we don't really need any constructors in this because for this tutorial at least, we're going to be creating our sound effects in the inspector. That will handle everything. But just for the sake of being able to create a new one, if we just do, if you wanted to create it in code, you could do public sound effects, and then just go string name, audio clip, and then just set our values. And you could also just have a basic one that doesn't take any values, because obviously you're not necessarily going to, sometimes you might want to create an empty one, in which case we don't actually need to do anything because we've already set our null values up here. And then if you wanted, you could have another constructor which took in just an audio clip, or you could have a constructor that took in all the values that we're going to change. I'm just doing this to show you how it can work. None of this needs to be done for this tutorial. The one thing that does need to be done for this tutorial is we're going to have a public function, and we'll just call this attach, and all this does is it will take in an audio source, and it will apply all the settings and put the clip that we are passing into, that we've got here, into that audio source, and then play it. Sorry about my typing, I've got a new keyboard and it's a slightly different layout and I'm just getting used to it still. And that's it for our sound effects class. That's all we need to do for that. So up here, now that we have that class, we need to create a public array. And this one can be an array because we don't necessarily... If you wanted to modify this list in code at runtime, maybe consider making it a list rather than an array. But because we're just going to be setting all our sounds in the inspector before we start the game, we're fine just using an array for this one. So the first function we are going to create is to get our audio source. So this will return an actual audio source. It doesn't take in any values. And the first thing we do is we loop through each, if we have any, we loop through each of our audio sources in our audio source array. And we just do a simple check if source dot is playing. If source is not playing, that's not a function actually. If source is not playing, then we know we've found an available source that we can use because it's not doing anything right now. Because that's the metric I'm going to use for determining whether a source is available or not. If the source is playing, you could have other metrics. You could not care whether it's playing. You could just decide to take it anyway. I'm going to use whether it's playing or not. So if we loop through our sources and we find one that's not playing, we treat that as available, and then we just return that. And that's fine, job done. However, if we don't find one, now this could be because it's the first time we've tried to play a sound and we haven't created any audio sources yet, or it could be we've only created 2 audio sources and they're both been used. Then we want to create a new audio source. So the first thing we want to do then is check that we haven't exceeded our audio source limit. This max sources here. If audio sources dot count is less than max sources, so only do it if we're still under our limit. We want to create a new game object. We'll call it new audio source, it really doesn't matter. Equals new game object. And then we want to, just for the sake of neatness, parent this to whatever object, to our sound effects handler essentially, because we don't want these audio sources just floating around. And then we will create a new audio source component and add it to our list. And then finally, we just want to return that audio source, which we're gonna pull from the. We could just return the one directly attached, but we're gonna pull the reference from the list just to show that everything's working. So audio sources, I don't know why I put that there. So return audio sources, and then the index we need is the last index of the list. So audio sources dot count, and then -1, because the count will be 5, saying it's got 5 items, but the actual index will be 4 because it starts at 0. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 equals 5 items. So that gives us our audio source if we haven't created one and we can't find one that is currently available. And then the last potential outcome is we haven't got any available audio sources and we are at our limit. So we can't create another one and we haven't got one available. In that case, we will just throw up a warning. What we say, no available audio sources found, and max number of audio sources reached. This is, again, entirely preferential. It's just because I'm doing this tutorial and trying to make sure everything is easily understandable that I'm putting all this extra stuff in. And then we're just going to return null. So that's that function. And now we need our actual play sound function. So this one's going to be public because this needs to be accessible by other scripts. This is the whole point of this particular function, this particular script even. Nice and simple. We're just going to call it play sound. It will take in a string, which is the name of the sound in our sounds array, and it's going to take in a position. And that position is just going to be kind of the whole point of having a sound effect manager like this is that you can play sounds anywhere in the world as you need them. You're probably going to want those sounds to be, unless it's like a 2D game, you're going to want those sounds to be 3D altered. So you want to be able to tell them to be 3D sound effects. So if a sound is happening off to the right, you want that represented in the game. Of course, the way you do that is you set it as a 3D sound. I think I've still got in here. There we go, with this spatial blend here. You set that to 3D. In fact, we just want to, by default, again, this is something you can change, but we're going to do it here. You want it to be 3D, really. I mean, you could set it to 2D, but basically, if my camera is here and this sound plays, but to achieve that, it needs to be in the right place spatially in the world, which is why it's going to take in this vector3 location, because we're going to move the sound component to that location before we actually play it. So the first thing we do is we get ourselves an audio source. And we do that by calling our getAudioSource function. We don't need to pass any values to that. That's just going to give us an audio source, or it's not if we haven't got any. So the first thing we want to do after that is check to make sure we do actually have one. If audio source is equal to null, meaning we haven't received an audio source, then we just return out. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do. No sound will be played. We'll have our warning message from here, but other than that, that's the end of the road for this function. However, if we do have an audio source, we're going to loop through each of our sound effects. And we're going to check each one to see if the name of that sound effects equals the string that we've passed in here. There. If sound effect equals sound effects.name. So if it equals that, we've found the matching sound, and that means that we're going to go ahead and play it. We've got an audio source, we've got a sound, so we will move our audio source position to the location. We'll spell position correctly though. And we'll take our sound effects and attach it to our new clip, attach it to our new audio source, sorry. And then we're done. We just return out because the attach function itself will set that sound effect playing. So we don't need to do anything else, we just return there. But we do have to do one final state, which is if we get to here, we haven't returned already, that means that we could not find the correct audio source. If we've returned out there, we've already, not audio source, sorry, sound effect. If we return here, that means we couldn't find an audio source, but we've already thrown up a warning for that one. So we're going to put another warning here, and this one is just going to tell us specifically what sound effect we attempted to find that could not be found. If you didn't know already, the backslash makes the next character be treated as an actual character. So obviously quotation marks it would treat as the end of the string. The backslash makes the code treat it as quotation marks as opposed to the end of the string. So if I took that backslash away, then it thinks that that's the end of the string, and then whatever's afterwards is outside of the string, which obviously I want these quotation marks in the string, so the ones immediately after the backslash are treated as quotation marks, and then these quotation marks are treated as the end of the string. That sounded way more complicated out loud than it did in my head. fx name plus, and then again with the backslash to close the quotation marks in the string, in sounds array. So not only will that tell us that we weren't able to find whatever sound we were asked for, it will tell us what sound we were asking for. So, you know, you can properly debug it. You can go in and find where you're asking for this sound that doesn't exist. And that's the end of our play sound function. So there is one last thing we're going to do. This is entirely unnecessary if you, for some reason, wanted to take in a complete reference to your sound effects handler. If you wanted to have a reference ready on hand in every single object that might need to call this function. So in any script, if you were just going to have a sound effects handler reference in there, you could just call that reference. However, the way I envisage this script being used is you're never going to know exactly which objects are going to need to call the sound handler, so you can't really expect to have a reference to all of them. So we're going to make a global reference that we can use without having to directly reference a script, and we're going to do that using a singleton pattern. So first thing we need to do up here, I'm just going to create a private static sound effects handler underscore instance, and then a public static sound effects handler, and this one is a full-on instance, and all this does is it returns the instance above. And then we need to handle this in our awake function. So we just do a quick check. If instance is not null and instance does not equal this, then we just get rid, because we only want one instance. So if there has already been an instance of the sound effects handler created in the game, we don't want two, we don't want another one. So if we've already created one, for some reason we've accidentally created a second one, we just want to get rid of it. However, if it's not this, then we want to set instance to this. And then what that allows us to do is we can call a global instance of sound effect handler instance, and we will get this script anywhere in the project. So if we go back to Unity, nothing much will have changed yet because we haven't done anything. Let's make sure I've saved that. Yep. So what we want to do is go into, again, just ignore all of this. This is all the code I just wrote to make the fancy lights glow. The only thing we're interested in is that at some point this function here is what actually sets it off, sets it glowing. So that's where we want to play our sound. So all we need to do to play our sound is sound effects handler dot instance, spelt correctly, and then we call our function play sound. I've already stored in the script what the name of the sound needs to be, so I just put sound name, that's the string that we're going to pass in, and then obviously the position wants to be the actual position of this bright flashy light. And the only thing that's left to do now is to actually set our sounds. We'll use this game object here, rename it sound effects handler. We don't need this audio source. So drag a sound effects handler on here. We're going to create 4 sounds, one for each shape. I've already created some sounds, as you can see here. The name just basically corresponds to, it's a note, and that is the, I don't know why that's at 0, it should be at 1, but okay. So that's an A note. This one is a C note, and you can see how the rest of it goes. So now we have an array of sounds. If you imagine a more practical use of this would be arrow impact sound, sheep bar sound. Well, it depends on what game you're making, but this is literally, I've just created this to demonstrate the program working. My script here is going to call sound effects handler. It's going to pass in the sound name, which, like I say, I've already set in this in the objects themselves, and then that's going to search in here, find one that matches, and play it. So if we press play now, this should all work. And if I play everything really fast, we should probably get a warning. There we go. You see, because the sounds were still playing, we managed to exceed our limit because none of them were available because all 4 were playing, and we obviously created one extra one. And then we hit our limit of 5 and we couldn't create any more. And also, if I were to go in here and change this to something that's nothing to do with it, doesn't really matter what, and then run the script again, we'll get a warning telling us that obviously there's no sound attached that matches that. There we go. And that is the end of our script. That is how to create a basic sound manager, sound effects handler. I'll set one looping just to demonstrate that working. I can't remember which one is attached to A, but yeah, so there, it's just going to carry on looping. Obviously, you'd have to write code to, at some point, stop it looping, but that would depend entirely on what it is you're actually doing with the sound effect. So I hope this was useful. Next week, we're probably going to be getting back to the Minecraft series, and for now, thank you and goodbye.